Hi, and welcome to the Institute for Faith, Work, and Economics' first ever live video webinar. My name is Katie Shoup. I'm a communications associate, and I'm happy to welcome you to 8 common misconceptions Christians have about poverty and wealth. Today I'm joined by Dr. Jay Richards, who is a distinguished fellow at the Institute. He's also the New York Times best-selling author of 2 books, Indivisible, and most recently, Infiltrated. He's also the author of Money, Greed, and God, which we will be talking about a great deal today. For those of you unfamiliar with the Institute, we're a Christian research organization committing to explaining the economic and biblical principles to help people find fulfillment in their work and to contribute to the flourishing of society. So Jay, thank you so much for being with me today.
Katie, great to be with you.
All right, so let's dive right in.
Sure.
Actually, we are going to take questions. The format today, we'll talk for maybe 30 minutes and then take your questions. So please feel free to submit those at any time. You can email them to me to kshoup@tifwe.org, or you can tweet them to us at @faithworkecon. All right. So first question, what motivated you to write this book and to research this topic?
I mean, this is the question of faith and economics actually has bothered me since college. And I graduated from college in the 1980s prior to the collapse of the Soviet Union and found myself as a freshman in college. I'd been raised in the church. Got off to college and was reading the Communist Manifesto. And of course, I know Matthew 25. I had, that was sort of down in my bones that as Christians we're to be concerned about the least of these. And God cares about the poor, He expects us to as well. And unfortunately, because I didn't really understand anything about economics, when I read the Communist Manifesto and books by American socialists, I very quickly became convinced that Christians, if we're going to be concerned about the poor and our fellow human beings, ought to be socialist. Now, I kept reading so that by the time I graduated from college, I had worked my way out of that opinion, and then frankly, the Soviet Union collapsed a couple of years later, and so I thought, okay, this is an argument that's been settled. I started writing on other things, but found myself back on Christian college campuses about 1999, and discovered that a lot of the ideas that I had in my mind in the 1980s were still alive and well in the 1990s in the minds of college freshmen and college sophomores. And this was after the collapse of the Soviet Union, so that convinced me the case for a free economy and the case for the compatibility of Christian theology and the free economy needs to be made anew to every generation. And so that's what inspired this book that became Money, Greed, and God.
Great. So do you think we can ever create a perfectly just society?
I mean, that's one of the first questions people usually ask. And in my book, I actually try to address these common questions and also talk about these individual myths that I describe. And by myths, I just mean these are sort of ideas that are intellectual roadblocks to thinking clearly about these questions. And so the myth that corresponds to this question, can't we build a more just society? Well, yes, of course. But we always want to ask ourselves the question, just compared to what? If we don't, we can commit what I call the nirvana fallacy or nirvana myth. And basically, that's just comparing the real world economy and hustle and bustle, say, of the American economy with an unrealizable ideal, with nirvana, or if you're a Christian, with the kingdom of God. We believe as Christians, of course, that the kingdom of God is both already but not yet. But we know that though as we act as Christians in the world, the kingdom of God is impinging and entering into the world, but it hasn't reached yet its full consummation. God has to do that. We can't do it ourselves. And the temptation is to think, okay, there's this sort of perfectly linear line up to perfection, and we could try to achieve that in ordinary society. The problem is when people actually do that, and we know this from the evidence of the 20th century, the best way to create hell on earth is to try to bring heaven down to earth. And that's sort of the dilemma. And so the question we want to ask is, what is the best economic system of the live alternatives? That is, of the alternatives that we have some prospect of bringing about.
Okay, so as Christians, what should we do?
Well, the initial, the famous question that, what would Jesus do? Which, I mean, it seems a little trite, and I can remember when kids are wearing the armbands. That's not actually quite the right question, though. The question would be something like, what would Jesus have me do? That's really the question, because Jesus had a unique mission. We want to know in particular circumstances what we ought to do. And this is very important, but I argue that you have to understand and recognize another myth, what I call the piety myth. And I call it the piety myth because piety has to do with the state of your hearts. And when we ask the question, what would Jesus have us do? We often don't focus on the doing part. We don't focus on the action. We focus on how we feel about it. And so the piety myth is essentially confusing our good intentions with the real effects of our actions. I love the quote by Henry Hazlitt, who talks not about the science, but the art of economics. He says, the art of economics consists in looking not merely at the immediate, but at the longer effects of any act or policy. It consists in tracing the consequences of that policy, not merely for one group, but for all groups. That's the art of economics. If you can get that down in your bones, so that when somebody says, hey, you know, let's raise the federal minimum wage to $100 an hour. You don't say, well, I know you mean well, and that's great. You say, okay, you mean well, but then what will happen if we actually do that? That's how we avoid the piety myth, is thinking through the consequences and unintended consequences of action. So, you know, there's dozens of examples of the piety myth in action, from the financial crisis, which I argue would be is the result of well-meaning affordable housing goals on the part of the federal government. Rent control, which is normally designed to keep rental housing available for lower income people. Its effect, unfortunately, is to make that rental housing actually scarce. And so it does exactly the opposite of what you want it to do. That's what happens when you don't attend to the nature of economic reality, which has these kind of counterintuitive consequences. And the way to inoculate ourselves against that is to learn, I think, to recognize the piety myth.
Okay. So there can be problems when the government gets involved, but if the government doesn't get involved, don't we have a problem with unfair competition?
Well, this is sort of the dilemma, and I think it's important to clarify that I would argue for the virtues of a free economy or free enterprise, whatever you want to call it, but that doesn't mean that anything goes. I'm not talking about the Lord of the Flies, right? You know, where the big kids torture and lord it over the small kids. What I'm talking about when I'm talking about a sort of free exchange or voluntary exchange is a context within the rule of law. So we can't kill each other, can't steal from each other, can't defraud each other. You know, this is sort of the Ten Commandments applied to everyday life. Once you have the rule of law, then you have the conditions for free exchange. And this is where a lot of people, including a lot of Christians, get confused, because we assume that any trade between two people must involve a winner and a loser. So if, you know, some person is getting richer, that means somebody somewhere else is getting poorer. I mean, this was at least the kind of stereotype of the Occupy Wall Street movement, was that, you know, 1% of the population is fabulously wealthy and presumably leaving the 99% of the rest of us to sort of, you know, live on our own with the meager scraps that are left. That's the sort of general attitude. The question is, are there types of exchanges that aren't like that aren't zero sum, right? That's a zero sum game myth. It just means that trade, by definition, requires that there be a winner and a loser. And this is a term from game theory, and a zero sum game is like a win-lose game. It just means the logic of the game requires that if there's a winner, there's got to be a loser. And that's actually how most of our games are, right? If you play chess or checkers or football, the logic of the rules require that there be a winner and a loser. The question is, are there economic arrangements where that's not true? I mean, you can have a win-lose or zero-sum game, right? You can have a lose-lose game, and that'd be a game where everybody ends up worse off than they were when they started, right? We don't tend to play those games.
Right.
But then there are also win-win games, and win-win games are just games in which everyone that plays ends up better off than they would have been if they hadn't played. It doesn't mean everybody ends up equally well off, right? If I walk into a room with 5 other people, I come out with $100, somebody comes out with 1,000, somebody comes out with $1 million. We're all better off, right, than when we went in the room, presumably, if somebody just handed us the money. But there are others that are better off than I am. It's still a win-win game. That's the sort of essential thing to understand, is that when you have the setting, when you have the context for free exchange, what you do is you set up opportunities for win-win exchanges. I mean, we experience this constantly every day. If I go get my hair cut, I only will get my hair cut and pay the barber, right? If I value the haircut more than I value the money it's going to cost to get the haircut. And she's not going to cut my hair unless she values the money over the time it takes to cut my hair. That's a win-win. It's not like a poker game where you walk in, you know, and somebody maybe ends up with all the money and you walk out a loser. Or if you go into a grocery store. When you go into a grocery store, the grocer's not standing there saying, let's play rock, paper, scissors, and if you lose, you give me your money, right? I mean, you go, you leave money, and you return with groceries. I tell this story in the book that is called The Trading Game. It's an actual story from my childhood in the 6th grade, in which we had to stay in from recess because of bad weather, and the teacher had anticipated this and bought a bunch of dollar toys for everyone. All cost about the same thing: silly putty, paddleball, Barbie trading cards, this kind of stuff. Passed them all out to us. He said, okay, we're going to play a game today called The Trading Game. I want you first, though, to look at the toy you have in your hand and decide how much you like it, and give it a score between 1 and 10, right? And so if you like it, it's a 10. If you don't like it, it's a 1. But she's told us just write down your score. And so we did that, right? And she said, okay, now call out the numbers that you gave to your toys. And we all did that. She added up the total, and then she wrote them on the board. She said, okay, now that's the beginning of the game. She said, in the first round of the trading game, you can freely trade with everyone else in your row. Now, sort of think of the classroom as 5 rows of 5. It's sort of simplest that way. That would mean everybody has 4 potential trading partners on the first trade, right? And so you can imagine there was some trading going on here. But notice the teacher had said, freely trade with anyone else that's in your row. In other words, you can't threaten the little girl behind you, right, with the toy, with the paddle ball, if she doesn't trade you for the Barbie trading cards. It only happens if both of you perceive yourself as better off as a result of the trade. So there's some trading, not a huge amount. And then she said, okay, now write down again the score of the toy that you have in your hand. And so everybody did that. Of course, some were the same, but some were different. And so then she had us call out the total, or call out the individual, and she totaled it and put the total on the board. And you know what happened? The number went way up. Mm-hmm. Well, that was dramatic, but what was especially dramatic was the second round of the game, in which she said, okay, now you can freely trade with anyone in the classroom. Well, this means each of us had 24 potential trading partners, right? And that you can imagine, if you know anything about networking, how many different trades were possible. So, total chaos. The kid that had never said anything until that day suddenly is doing these complicated calculations to figure out how to do multiple trades. Chaos for about 5 minutes, and then finally it settles down. No more trades are possible. Again, she has us write down on a piece of paper between 1 and 10 how much we like the toy. We call them out, she adds up the total, and you can imagine what happened. The number went way, way up. Now, this might seem trivial, but in fact, I would argue it's one of the greatest mysteries in the universe, because remember, nothing new has been added to the system here. All that's happened, there was an initial input of toys, and then a system of rules that was put in place, right? There was a rule of law. The teacher enforced it. Students, I hope, sort of had internalized the rule of law, knew there were certain things that they couldn't do. So that if any toys traded hands, it only happened in the context of a win-win exchange. That's the logic of free exchange. And so very often when we see things that we think are unfair, you got to look at the situation carefully. Is this truly the result of somebody defrauding someone, in which case it's like theft, that's unjust? Or are the things that people have and the jobs they do the result of voluntary and free exchange? And if they are, then we can assume that it's win-win. That's just the logic of the game.
Okay, but isn't capitalism still based on greed?
I mean, this was honestly the question that I struggled with in college, and I'll tell you why. It's because I started by reading the Communist Manifesto and a book called Democracy for the Few by an American socialist. By the time I'd gotten to my senior year, I had read Thomas Sowell and Friedrich Hayek and a lot of the sort of classic free market economists, but I had also read Atlas Shrugged by AYN Rand, and I was transfixed. In fact, I was supposed to be studying for a German final and was reading Atlas Shrugged instead. And I read it, and it's compelling. It's the kind of thing when you read it when you're in college, it's, it seems sort of transgressive, like, gosh, I can't believe people are saying, somebody's saying this kind of thing. And so it's compelling, and I'm convinced later it's compelling because Rand was the only one to make the entrepreneur a hero in her literature. Almost no artist has ever done that. Unfortunately, another idea also got kind of set in concrete in my mind from Rand, and it's this idea that capitalism equals greed. That's what I would call the greed myth. The greed myth is not that greed exists in the market. I mean, of course, we're a fallen race. We all bear the mark of original sin, and so you get 2 or 3 people together in a room, right? You're going to have some greed. The greed myth, though, says that the essence of capitalism is greed or selfishness. And Rand really sort of put a sharp edge on this. I mean, she actually even wrote a book called The Virtue of Selfishness. And in this book, I remember she said capitalism and altruism are incompatible. They're philosophical opposites. They cannot exist in the same manner in the same society. I mean, that's a pretty hard claim, especially if you're a Christian, because altruism, unlike Rand's understanding, altruism is simply acting for the benefit of the other, which is what we're commanded to do. Christ sacrificed himself for others, and he commands us to do that. But it doesn't always mean that we're sacrificing. Very often, we're just simply acting for the benefit of others. If it were true that capitalism and real altruism were incompatible, Christians would have a problem with capitalism because, of course, selfishness is one of the 7 deadly sins, and altruism is one of the key virtues of the Christian life. And so this was something, honestly, I struggled with for years, even until I was in seminary. Finally read some books by people like George Gilder and Michael Novak that convinced me that this picture of the essence of capitalism is driven by greed was wrong. Yeah, certainly there's greed in a market, but if you've got a free market economy, the best way for somebody to get successful, right, to make a profit, is to provide something that people will freely buy. I mean, it's a famous statement by Adam Smith that it's not from the benevolence of the butcher or the brewer or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interest. His point isn't that butchers ought to be greedy and then we'll all be better off. His point is simply that in a free market, the butcher can just be concerned about his rent or getting braces for his daughter. But in order to fulfill that need, that generally self-interested need, he will have to provide something that people will freely buy at a price they're willing to pay. And so in other words, he'll have to act in a sense altruistically. Now that doesn't mean, again, that he's thinking warm thoughts and warm fuzzies about his customers, but it's altruistic in the sense that it's acting for the benefit of the other. And that's the essence of a free exchange. The fact that there's greed in the system, greed is a constant. And so whether you have a capitalist system or a cronyist system like the one, frankly, we have now, or a socialist system, or even a tribal system, there's going to be greed. What distinguishes a free economy from the alternatives is not greed, it's this opportunity for free exchange and for serving other people even while we pursue our legitimate self-interest.
Well, how about historically? Have Christians ever embraced capitalism?
This is a tough question, and it occurred to me that a lot of people probably don't ask this question unless they study Christian history, because if you study the history of Christian theology, what you discover is that there's a period of about 15 centuries in which all Christians, first Catholics and then Catholics and Orthodox, and later Catholics, Protestants, and Orthodox, said that lending money for interest was intrinsically wrong. It was this sin called usury. And in fact, Luther, even after the Reformation, was convinced of this. People have often thought, and Christians think, well, this seems to be based on Scripture. And this is certainly what early Christians thought, because the Bible does speak about lending and interest. In Leviticus, the Hebrews are commanded not to lend interest to their fellow Israelites. What's interesting, though, is that in the book of Deuteronomy, the command is you can't lend it interest to your fellow Israelites, but you can lend it interest to people outside your community, to foreigners that are someplace else. Now, we didn't often really notice that, though, and then, of course, you go to the New Testament. It doesn't talk about usury, per se, but you do get things like Jesus in Luke 6, who says, that you should lend expecting nothing in return. And so people took those passages of Scripture in Christian theology, and they connected it with an argument by the Greek philosopher Aristotle about the nature of money. And here's Aristotle's basic argument. He essentially said, it's legitimate to charge someone for, say, selling them a cow or selling them a pineapple because it's fecund, right? It has value, it grew. If you had a cow, you could milk it and things like that. Money, on the other hand, is not fecund, it's not fertile, it's sterile, it's just a unit of exchange. And so Aristotle thought, okay, if you charge somebody just for a money loan, you're essentially charging them for nothing of value. It's a valueless thing. It's like you're charging them not for a yard of cloth, you're charging them for a yard, right? It's not actually a thing. It doesn't have value. And so what happened, and it's a complicated story that I discuss in the book of how the usury debate finally got settled, but the sort of gist of it was that Christians learned to distinguish between the biblical text and what they said and Aristotle's argument about the nature of money. Because what happened is it became very obvious that Aristotle's argument just doesn't hold water, at least in a modern context, because in a modern economy with a banking system, a business loan, if I'm a bank and I give somebody a $100,000 loan, right, and I charge them interest for it, I'm charging them for something, right? I'm charging them because I have a risk that I bear because I gave the loan, and the opportunity cost I give up by giving them the money rather than using it for some other use. And so you're actually charging for something when you give that kind of loan. The other thing about Aristotle's argument, he assumed money was sterile. But we, of course, know. I mean, a capital loan, a business loan, can be quite fertile. A loan to start a business that's successful can actually lead to the creation of more wealth and more jobs. So at least in certain contexts, we now understand money is fertile rather than sterile. And so then the question is, okay, what do we do as Christians with the biblical texts? Well, we don't do anything with them. We don't try to toss them out. We look at them carefully. And when you do that, what you discover is this crucial distinction in the Old Testament, from Leviticus to Deuteronomy, between Israelites lending and charging interest to each other. Remember, they were told that they could charge others interest. So what that meant is that clearly charging interest wasn't intrinsically evil. It was just, it was wrong for Israelites to do it amongst themselves. Now, why is that? Well, we have a hard time thinking about tribal cultures. But of course, ancient Israel is a tribal culture. And so somebody's charging their fellow Israelite interest. They're basically probably charging their brother or first cousin or fellow tribesman. So they're essentially taking a family relationship and turning it into a commercial relationship. And so really in the Old Testament, the command is essentially that. Don't treat a family relationship as if it's an ordinary business relationship. Jesus' statement, if you look at it carefully, he says, when you lend, expect nothing in return. He actually doesn't say anything about interest. What's he talking about? Is he saying, well, banks should just give out money and not, expect to ever see it again? Well, no. Jesus also said, if someone, asks you for your shirt, give them your coat also. He wasn't saying it was wrong for people to sell coats, right? Obviously, clothing merchants can have a legitimate business. What he was saying is that he's encouraging his followers to be generous, so that when we're generous and we lend someone something, right, we don't fixate on it and we don't expect it ever to have it returned. He was encouraging generosity. He wasn't actually saying anything about interest in bank loans. And that's kind of a long story, but that's a complicated backstory to Christian theology. And so that's why now we accept the legitimacy, and Catholics, Orthodox, and Protestant Christians all accept the legitimacy of charging interest. What's interesting, though, as a result of the financial crisis in 2008, there were actually some Christian scholars who called for Christians to reconsider Islamic forms of banking. Now, in Islam, they've never resolved this question the way we have in the Christian world with respect to interest, and so it's still officially illegal to charge interest in Islam. This, to me, was a kind of striking claim, and I heard this from several Christian leaders, and so I realized, okay, that's seriously, throwing out the baby with the bathwater. We need to get clear on the nature of interest in money loans if we're not going to make some kind of severe mistake.
Okay, but even so, doesn't capitalism cause us to become kind of an ugly consumerist culture?
This is probably the toughest objection, and because what's funny is a lot of the objections that we often get for a free economy, they come more from the political left, but this one is just as common from the political right. I know when I wrote Money, Greed, and God, a guy named Rod Dreher, who writes now for the American Conservative, had written a book called Crunchy Cons, and he essentially argued for the kind of aesthetic impoverishment of what he referred to as capitalism. And it's funny because I was reading the book just as I visited Hong Kong. And anybody that's been to Hong Kong knows, especially in the Kowloon district, which is just kind of across the bay from downtown, I mean, it's thronged with merchants. They're on the streets, they're on the sidewalks, there are signs going up several stories so you can hardly see the sky, neon signs, people are trying to sell you stuff. This is kind of the ugly capitalism that I think people often imagine, or they think about unattractive strip malls in suburbs and things like that. Well, of course, I'm not going to argue those are attractive things. I don't especially like the garishness in Hong Kong. But I think it's important to distinguish between economic arguments and economic judgments and aesthetic ones. And so, of course, I would prefer a nice, pleasant, urban shopping environment with small little shops and things like that. The truth of the matter is, stuff in those places is far more expensive. So the reality is that, you know, if you're a mother of 5 and you're trying to get by on a limited budget, you're going to be interested in places, the big box stores like Costco and Walmart. Is that illegitimate? Have you sort of sold your soul? Well, no, you're just simply evaluating things differently. It's more important to you that your kids have enough to eat, right, than that your surroundings and your shopping are pleasant. To make the mistake of confusing those is what I call the ARTSY myth. And so that's the kind of crucial distinction that I would encourage people to make. Many of the innovations of industrialism are profound. I mean, even in the lowest income countries now, life expectancy is about twice what it was just 100 years ago. In the developed world, it's even much greater. And so the sort of mass production and industrialization has led to a drastic decrease in things like childhood and at-birth deaths. It's increased the availability of goods that were only available to the elites a few centuries ago. So that now you might think, okay, well, is capitalism aesthetically impoverished? It's only the industrial methods of the free economy that have made it possible for any ordinary kid, even in the below the poverty line, to, if he wants to, listen on his iPod to Mozart or Beethoven. This is something that no one could have done before. And so my sort of advice when it comes to dealing with these aesthetic questions is to say, let different things be different and accept that some things are, they're useful, but they're not especially beautiful. What's fascinating is that after a country reaches or a society reaches a certain sort of financial level or per capita income, what happens is that our priorities change. So think if you're a very low income person in which 40% of your budget, right, it goes to food, you're not going to be focused probably on the aesthetics of the food experience or the supply chain for the food. You're concerned about cost. That's perfectly legitimate. But there's something that you could sort of call it an aesthetic Kuznets curve that happens in society, so that once people become fairly prosperous. So most Americans, our food income is just about 10 or less than 10% of our income. Now these questions, things like the artisanal foods, the artisanal economy, it makes sense that that would emerge after industrialism. But it's important to realize that, right now, if you want to buy free-range eggs and organic milk, you're free to do that because we have a free economy. But we shouldn't try to make that mandatory, because at the moment, those are mostly luxury goods. Mm-hmm. The nice thing about a free economy is that it allows people that are just trying to make ends meet to make their choices, which we might not like aesthetically, but it also allows others of us to make different choices if we so prefer. That's the great thing about freedom.
But can't that create a problem with resources? You constantly hear that Americans consume an extremely large portion of the world's resources. Aren't we going to run out at some point?
Yeah, I mean, this is probably the most intuitive objection. And so, I mean, it's usually put this way: look, if we keep using up oil at the same rate that we're using it up, there's a finite amount of the stuff, and so we'll use it up, we'll run out. Well, that would be true if the premise were true, if we keep using oil at the same rate. But this ignores the nature of economic reality. So what's happening right now, let's just focus on energy resources, for instance. Remember, even oil was not previously a resource. Oil was either you didn't know about it, it was under the ground somewhere, or a farmer saw it in his field and it was treated as a pollutant. It only became a resource when people figured out that there was energy latent in it. We figured out ways to refine it so it could be used, and we developed technologies that could use the energy. Then it became a resource, and it's kind of hard for people to get their minds around. But most resources, properly speaking, actually are not just something out there in nature. There's something from nature that is also infused with human creativity and ingenuity. Even drinkable water, most of the water that we drink, we're not getting it from a fresh spring, we're getting it because of some kind of human process. And so the first thing is to understand what's the nature of a resource. And once you see that, well, most of the relevant resources involve our own creativity, you realize that our ability to use resources, it changes over time, right? It's not always the same thing. This is it's sort of hard for us to get. So at the moment, let's just take oil. We, of course, refine it as gasoline for those who drive cars. It's the most economical resource at the moment to use. We know how to refine it. There's an abundance of the stuff. It's very energy intensive. But let's say we kept using it, right? So we're using it and it gets more and more and more scarce. What's going to happen economically? I mean, what people imagine is we just keep using this stuff. What they're forgetting is that the oil will, if we keep doing that, eventually become less and less available. And as it becomes less available and we can, harder time discovering new oil reservoirs, what's going to happen? The price of oil is going to go up. And so at some point, there's a price point. It's probably something like $300 a barrel right now, at which oil will no longer be an economical resource. This is actually what happened with wood in Great Britain. There was worry on the main island of Britain a few hundred years ago because wood was the main source of fuel. And as a result, people would go out into the woods, cut down trees, and they're using the wood as fuel. And there was a fear that they were going to run out of wood and run out of forests. And it almost happened. They almost completely stripped the island clean. But what happened is that got near to occurring, the price for wood went through the roof. Mm-hmm. And very quickly people realized, okay, we need to use something else. And it's often said that necessity is the mother of invention, but human beings are the father of invention. And so you have the necessity of scarcity. What ends up happening historically is that people look for new and alternative uses or new resources. In this case, the British went from wood to coal, and then later from coal to gas and nuclear power and all those kinds of things. That's the kind of crucial thing to understand, is that a resource isn't just something out there that we're using up. There are basic economic laws that govern how we use it. And so the fact that we're using a certain resource right now doesn't mean that if we just let people do that freely, we're going to run out of the stuff. What it means is that if it's finite and scarce, eventually the price of those things, if we keep using it at that rate, will go up. And then we'll either figure out how to use it more efficiently, or we'll look for alternative resources. Now, it's very hard to get intuitively, I know. And so I always encourage people that really want to get into this to read a book like The Ultimate Resource 2 by Julian Simon. He gives hundreds and hundreds of examples of the ways in which human ingenuity transforms the natural resources around us, so that we don't just sort of leave things the way they are. As stewards, God has placed us here, not as despoilers, not as dominators, but as stewards. And our stewardship involves transforming the natural world around us for good purposes. And in doing that, we actually create new resources. What I like about this is that this is something people know economically. We know that under certain conditions, economies grow, right? They get bigger, they get better. But what's remarkable about this is how it's possible, because this idea that wealth could be created is somewhat counterintuitive, right? I mean, we tend to think of wealth as just sort of breadcrumbs being passed around on the table. How is it that wealth can be created? Well, wealth can be created because human beings aren't just consumers, right? We're also creators and producers. We are made in the image of the creative God. And so as God is creative and exercises his creative freedom, he's the creator with a capital C, we're creators with a lowercase c. As a result of that, we're able to create wealth to transform the material world around us to create new resources. And this is a place where I think Christian theology and economics actually converge and help illuminate and reinforce each other.
Great. Well, it's almost time to move into question and answers, but do you have any concluding thoughts for us?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the really important thing for people to understand is that when we're talking about the free economy, you can use the word capitalism if you want. That's not the greatest word, I think, even though it's in the subtitle of my book. But let's talk about economic freedom or free enterprise. What we're dealing with is, again, as I mentioned earlier, it's not the Lord of the Flies. It's not anarchy in which everybody just gets to do what they want to do. Often when you hear free, if a kid hears that they're free to do something, they just think that means, oh, I can do whatever I want to do. That's not what freedom means, certainly in the Western context. I'm talking about ordered liberty in which there's a rule of law. So I'm not free to steal from my neighbor. I'm restricted because of the rule of law from doing that. But what happens is that when that rule of law is in place, it actually enables a greater and higher form of freedom called freedom for excellence. So for instance, a child, right, who my daughters both play the piano. Initially, before they had a piano lesson, they were free to sit down and plunk on the piano, right? But were they free to play Mozart or Handel? No. Or Debussy? No, of course not, because they didn't have the skills, they didn't know the rules. But once they did that, the more they've practiced and learned about music, the more free they are to make beautiful music with the piano. That's freedom for excellence, and that's what the rule of law sets up. And so we're talking about economic freedom, that's what we're talking about, a context with the rule of law, a limited government that's charged with defending the rule of law, but is not so powerful that it violates the rule of law. So I would argue that economic freedom is really the golden mean. I mean, people often will say, well, we want some third way between capitalism and socialism. Well, that's a false dilemma. The real sort of spectrum would be anarchy on one side, just pure anarchy, right? And totalitarianism or authoritarianism on the other, in which the state occupies all of society. Well, where's the midpoint? Well, the midpoint is where the state is enforcing the rule of law, but then allows people the freedom to exchange in sort of voluntary activity. That's economic freedom as the defenders at least understand it.
Wonderful. All right, well now we're going to move into our question and answer portion. So again, you can email them to us at kshoop@tifwe.org, or you can tweet them at us to @faithworkecon. So first question comes from Bob, and he asked, which are the most injurious to Christian believers, and which are the most injurious to America, referring to the myths?
Of the myths. The reason that I came up with the 8 is because what I realized in talking to thousands of college students, they had all sorts of objections. But what I realized is that they weren't all different objections, that they were very often some species of the same one. And so that's how I came up with the 8 individual myths. I couldn't boil them down any farther. But if I were going to say there was one that was more important and more injurious, it's probably the piety myth. I think a lot of Christians understand that we're not going to create the kingdom of God on earth. I think a lot of Christians are realistic about the nature of the economy, don't think it's all based on greed. But all of us are tempted to focus on the intentions for our actions rather than the effects of our actions, especially when it comes to economic policy. And the reason is because of our understanding of the moral life, right? We know that God cares not just what we do, but why we do it, both the internal and the external matters. And so we're tempted to think it's the same thing in economics. But in economics, why you do something doesn't have any effect on the consequences of the policy. So, if members of Congress unanimously support a bill, 535 members all agree to do it, the president signs it, they might have 535 different reasons for supporting the bill. The bill's going to have the same effect either way. Mm-hmm. And that's why I think it's so difficult for us as Christians to develop this as an art so that it's actually part of our intuition. But I think if we learn to do that, that's the one myth that I think if we inoculate ourselves against, we're more likely to get more done and more clear thinking about economics than any of the others.
Great. Tate on Twitter would like to know, can the U.S. economy be accurately described as a free market?
No, I don't think so. I mean, of course, a free economy is in many ways kind of an ideal type. You could say, isn't it another one of these, things like nirvana or the kingdom of God? The reality is, though, is that we can approximate free economies. And certainly Hong Kong, for instance, prior to becoming a part of the People's Republic of China was a very good example of this. In fact, it still is. The Chinese government, I think, realizes that it has a jewel on its hands. And so if you look at the index of economic freedom, every year Hong Kong still ends up at the top. What's at the bottom? It's inevitably North Korea. And so that sort of tells you something about what's going on, because that's the role of freedom. So it's possible. It's something we can bring about. We've seen what it looks like. And in fact, if you look at American history, I think there was a time in which our economy was much more free. So the question is, what is the American economy right now? Well, it's not socialism. I think that make a mistake if we say we're basically dealing with socialism. I mean, if you use that broadly, yeah, maybe. But the official definition of socialism is something like state ownership or common ownership of the means of production, which inevitably means the state ownership of private property, right? We don't have that. We still have a private sector, right? We even have private banks. We have private shops. We get an income and all these kinds of things. So we're not living in a socialist system. What I think we're living in is something that we could just call cronyism. And cronyism, it's sort of like the corporatism of the 19th and 20th centuries, in which rather than a free and open exchange and free competition, right, in the marketplace, what we have is collusion between certain large businesses and government. You saw this in the financial crisis with some of the bailouts. People, I think intuitively knew it seems like there's some well-connected financial institutions that are being treated differently than others. Well, I call that cronyism. I wouldn't even call it crony capitalism because it implies it's a type of capitalism. It's not economic freedom in any case. And the frustrating thing about cronyism is it's actually hard to diagnose because, if you've got a socialist system and government owns everything, right, then if something happens in the economy, the government gets the blame. Cronyism, though, it operates in which government regulators control a great deal in the private sector, but if something happens in the economy, the regulators can blame the private sector. And so it's actually difficult to see, okay, who's doing the bad stuff here? And so that's the dilemma of cronyism. I think cronyism is an example of what I would call soft tyranny, as opposed to the hard tyrannies that we saw in the 20th century. Those are easy to recognize. People run out in the streets and people start getting rounded up and sent to internment camps. We're going to know what that is, right? Mm-hmm. What we don't know how to recognize is the slow kind of creeping ratchet of the administrative state, which slowly takes control of every decision in the private sphere.
Yeah. Our next question: how should Christians help the poor rise if free market economics does lead to wealth creation and flourishing? So kind of asking about the practical aspects.
Yeah.
And hand in hand with that, next question here is asking about charity and the role of charity in all of this.
I mean, I think both of those are actually related questions, so I can see why you combine them, because of course charity is always going to play a role. But I think that as Christians, we often think that charity is going to fix everything. And so we think, well, the United States, we did not get prosperous from charity. We got prosperous from the rule of law and trade and invention and things like that. But we think, well, the sub-Saharan Africa, though, they're going to get prosperous just by our charity. And I think that's kind of a misguided understanding of how the world works. The world that God has created, the primary way in which entire cultures are lifted out of poverty is economic freedom. And in fact, you need economic freedom for prosperity, and you can't even really have charity until you have prosperity. So I think we should think of our charity as like the gleanings in the Old Testament, right? The Israelites were commanded that when they harvested their fields, leave the gleanings around the edge of the fields for the sojourners and the poor, so they'd have some extra. Notice that the gleanings required a prior abundance. All of Israel was not fed from the gleanings. In the same way, our charity is going to be the result of prior abundance. And so we have to both look at effective means of charity, but if we want to know how do we raise entire cultures out of poverty, the only way we're going to do that is by developing the cultural mores and institutions that allow for economic freedom. That's just the only way we know up the path.
Great. Next question. It is my understanding that most really wealthy people did not inherit the wealth, but were, quote, self-made. How can they best teach their children the importance of work if the children may not have seen anything but wealth and therefore expect to inherit great wealth and not really have to work for it?
Well, this is actually an important dilemma, and Arthur Brooks at the American Enterprise Institute has written on this. He's, if you look at the effects of people who win the lottery, for instance, they might, you might win $10 million. Statistically, though, it's one of the worst things that can happen to you is to win the lottery, and you can often 10 years later end up worse off. There are a lot of the same effects, unfortunately, for children that inherit great wealth. And I mean, you can sort of imagine how that would go if you have an entrepreneur and he starts a company and he gets fabulously wealthy through his hard work, his ingenuity, his willingness to risk, right? There's a learning curve that he goes up as he learns through failure and through success what to do and what not to do. And so he's a beneficiary of that knowledge. But if his children simply get a trust fund, they're not beneficiaries of that knowledge. In fact, they have been immunized from that learning opportunity that the parents had. So how do you avoid that? Well, I think honestly that if you're a person of means, you don't want to endow your kids so that they never have to work. I mean, it might be that I've known wealthy parents who've set things up so that they essentially, once their kids get out of college, they're willing to give them loans. to start a company, but they have to come up with an actual idea to start a company, because that's one of the saddest and preventable things, is when great entrepreneurs create vast wealth for themselves and others, but then they deprive their own children of being able to learn the same things that they did.
Yeah. Well, we are about out of time. Do you have any kind of last words of wisdom to share with us?
Honestly, I think for Christians that are really concerned about these issues, take time to read a few books. It's not like you have to study economics. A lot of times people will think I'm saying, if you want to apply the Christian faith in the economic sphere, you got to go take an economics course. And maybe that wouldn't be a bad thing to do, but that's not what I'm saying. What I think we need to do is develop what Hazlitt calls the art of economics, just this ability to think through the consequences of our actions. Because remember, we're commanded not just to love the Lord with our hearts, right? But to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your mind, and with all your strength. Your mind. We want to love the Lord not just with our hearts, but with our minds. And to do that, I think we have to master the art of economics.
Great. Well, I will go ahead and plug your book one more time. This has the 8 myths and a little bit more detail than we got into today about them. So Money Green Guide, highly recommend that. And also, I encourage you to check out IFWE's other resources. It's tifwe.org. I especially encourage you to check out our blog if you're interested in more specifics on poverty. That's been our latest blog series. I really encourage you to check that out. A lot of good information there. And thank you so much for joining us. Please follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, check out our website. And thanks again to Jay.
Thank you, Katie.
And thank you so much, and have a great afternoon.